Alright guys, William here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another video surrounding the Survivor Hall of Fame, where this is essentially a part 2 to my History of Survivor Hall of Fame video, where in that video I ran through the history of the Survivor Hall of Fame, while in this video I'll be talking about every year since and predict who I think would have been inducted to the Survivor Hall of Fame had it still continued, where obviously it concluded back in 2016, which means we have 8 years to be running through here. So again, I do want to still run through Survivor history, talk about who I think should be included over the course of those years. So with that, we're starting off with 2017, where again, at this time, it would have been during the airing of Survivor HHH. And really, I think the picks here are kind of obvious. Again, to me, these are people that should have been on the list already. These are people that, again, never made the Hall of Fame, that it was kind of egregious that they never did. They're just kind of just making up for lost time. And the first of which being Colby Donaldson. Again, it's insane that Colby never made the Hall of Fame. That's right, he was so popular at the time of Australian Outback that he had people naming their kids after him. He's such a fan favorite coming into All-Stars. And while obviously he has some of that luster was gone by time of Heroes versus Villains, I think it's egregious that he never actually made the Hall of Fame when you, again, have the likes of Tony and Cochran, these more recent players that did. Next up, again, how did Stephanie LaGrossa not make the Hall of Fame either? I think that's also egregious to me, to where, again, the fact that Kim made it on over Stephanie, I think is pretty insane. Now, again, Stephanie also did not have the greatest Heroes of Villains appearance, also did not have the greatest Guatemala appearance, to where maybe that played a factor, but she is still such an icon for the show that the fact that she never made the Hall of Fame is insane to me. And the final person is someone that had actually been pretty close to making the Hall of Fame before this. This is a person that I think would have made it on by this point, to where, again, while you could definitely qualm if they would have made it on at this specific point, I do think, considering how much the alumni community seemed to be backing him by the time of 2016, I think he probably would have just made the cut by this point. That person's Tyson Apostle. And again, Tyson was someone that was all over a lot of the ballots at the time of the later years of the Hall of Fame. So it really was just an inevitability of when is Tyson going to make the cut. And obviously the Hall of Fame just got cut before Tyson made the cut. But again, I think Tyson at this point would make it on. Obviously a winner of the show at this point, having won in Blood vs. Water. Also a decent amount of time since that happened. It would have been a good 4 years since then. And in general, also still a very popular character, and just in general, again, Tyson definitely would have made the cut by this point. Next, moving on to 2018, where again, this is at the time of David versus Goliath, and this is where I think we get to some intrigue here, where I think there are a number of ways that we can approach this. There are two people that I think are very recent that, again, I would not necessarily have on my Hall of Fame at this specific point, though I do think they are very likely to be voted on at this point. The question is what to do with the other slot, and I did want to give it to a bit of an older school player. And the person I did end up giving it to is someone that I don't know if they actually would have made the Hall of Fame necessarily, even though their name was definitely being brought up quite a bit by the end of the Hall of Fame, and that person is Brian Heidik. And again, Heidik is someone that, again, I don't like. I never have liked Brian Heidik, yet I cannot deny his impact on the show. And Heidik was essentially the first true villain to win the show. Again, like more so than just how Richard Hatch was looked at as a villain. Again, Brian Heidik was legitimately a villain that won the show, played in this very cutthroat way, this very, again, very icky way, but played this extremely domineering game that we hadn't really seen before. To where, while I think his legacy kind of gets overshadowed, the likes of Boston Rob, who plays essentially another version of his game in All-Stars, I still feel like Heidik was very important to the progression of the show, to where I decided to go with him by this specific point. And again, the other two people that I put on, again, were much more recent players that you can definitely qualm them being on this early, though I think at this point they were just such massive names in the community. So first up, we got Jeremy Collins. And again, Jeremy is someone that had won on Cambodia, obviously. I mean, at this point, this would be 3 years after Cambodia. And someone that was still talked about as one of the best winners. Someone that had a really interesting winning storyline as well, and Jeremy is just someone that is very revered by his Survivor community, to where I think by this point, again, considering how recent someone like a Tony got added into the list, and obviously Cochran and Kim, I feel like at this point Jeremy would be kind of a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame, especially considering his name started to appear a bit more towards the end. And the same thing goes with Kelly Wentworth. And again, Kelly Wentworth at this point would have been right before her appearance on the Edge of Extinction, which again, like Tony, I think maybe that could give her a little bump there as well. But also Kelly Wentworth just was such a massive star of the show at this point. Again, she is someone that was constantly talked about as the female player that a lot of the women coming into the game were talking about wanting to be the most like. Again, she is someone that has that going for her, but also again has her massive idol play, which is very remembered. Also is again a major fixture of the online community, to where I really do feel like Kelly Wentworth by this point would have been voted in, even though again does feel a little recent. With that, we then move on to 2019 for Survivor IOI, and this is an interesting spot in Survivor history, as this is literally right before the airing of Survivor Winners at War, to where I do wonder how much of an effect that would have had on this list. And two of the people I did add to the list here, both are players that will later appear in Winners at War. However, one person I added to the list is someone that isn't. However, there are other reasons why I put this person on the list, and that person is Sue Hawk. And Sue Hawk, obviously, massive legend of the show. Again, someone that was such an icon in the first season, such a notable figure. Her Snakes and Rash speech, one of the most iconic moments of the show, but I think by this point was kind of forgotten about. I don't think many people were talking about Sue Hawk in the lead up to 2019. However, again, this is during the airing of Survivor IOI. Obviously, a season that had this massive controversy surrounding Dan Spilo, to where it was during this time that there was a lot of talk about Sue Hawk and how mistreated she was in All Stars, to where I would not be shocked that that would have led to a lot of support for Sue Hawk for the Hall of Fame as well, to where I think Sue Hawk became a bit more talked about at this point in Survivor history, to where, considering that and the fact that she is, again, a very worthy, legendary figure of the show, I did decide to put Sue Hawk in at this point. And then the other two, I think, are both people that, again, would later appear in Winners at War, both people that had massive legacies by this point, and both people that, again, just kind of makes sense to be added to the list at this point. And first up, we got Yule. And again, Yule, I think, kind of is on here in the, again, Kelly Wentworth vein, the Tony vein of, again, players that I think people were excited to see them back in the upcoming season, to where I think there were a lot of hype for these people. And again, Yule in particular, again, obviously Ray has a really good run, had a very big reputation as being one of the smartest players to ever win, and obviously, like, had the use of his god idol, and obviously at the time represented for the Asian community on Survivor, to where, again, I think there's a lot to like from Yule from a Hall of Fame perspective, to where, again, I did put him on in this place. And the other person, again, another person with a massive legacy, that person's Denise Staple. And again, Winners at War ends up being a weird spot for Denise, where I feel like her legacy goes up and down at the same time in Winners at War. Yeah, I think at this point, again, there was a lot of hype for Denise. Again, Denise was constantly talked about as a person that survived every tribal, and that was something being used to really prop her up, along with the fact that, again, the Malcolm Denise dynamic was constantly talked about as this essentially go-to relationship to bring up whenever there is a younger guy working with an older woman. Where again, Denise was just really a major part of the Survivor lexicon, still is to this day, to where, again, as much as I personally find Denise to be an overrated player, I do feel like, again, her impact on the Survivor community is still pretty massive, considering how important her dynamic with Malcolm ends up being, to where, mixing out the fact that, again, she survives every tribal, again, it makes a lot of sense that she would be in the Hall of Fame by this point. Next for 2020, where obviously 2020 is a weird spot, where this is mid-COVID, where there was no season at the time that this poll would have taken place, though it is still after the airing of Survivor Winners at War. However, also in the midst of a really big cultural change in the real world. Again, this is in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement and CBS adopting the diversity initiative of making cast 50% POC. And through that, I do think that would have had a pretty big impact on who would have made this Hall of Fame. Because of that, the people I decided to add to the Hall of Fame from this year is, first up, we got Vesepia. And again, I think this would have been the perfect time to add Vesepia to the Hall of Fame. Sure, Vesepia is someone that I do think, had it not been for this more cultural significance, I do wonder if Vesepia would ever be added, considering I don't feel like she was someone that was brought up too often in the polls leading up to the end of the Hall of Fame. And in general, seems to be a forgotten about figure from the production side of things, to where the massive aspect of her legacy is the fact that she is the first ever POC winner. And that is a massive distinction for her. So I think, again, the notion that she is the first ever POC female winner, on the fact she also represents her community on the show and faces adversity due to that and overcomes that. Again, I think there is a lot to like for Vesepia here in terms of a Hall of Fame pick, to where I do think there would have been a push to get her on at this point. So again, I put her on along with Earl Cole as well. And again, I think Earl Cole at this point had really started to pop a bit more in the online community. I mean, not just because of the diversity mandate, but obviously, yes, he was very involved in the formation of that. But also, this is, again, immediately after Winners at War, in a spot where he was very close to making it on. Again, this is a spot where there was a lot of disappointment at the time that we could have seen Earl Cole play Survivor again. He didn't make it on in that spot, to where, again, mixing out the fact that, again, this diversity mandate as well, I do feel like, again, I think this would have been a good spot to put Earl, the first ever black guy to win the show. Also, a person that organized an all-black alliance, to where, again, I think there's a lot of cultural significance here to really benefit Earl's potential chances of making the Hall of Fame, to where I think this is kind of the year that would make a lot of sense for him to finally be added. And the final person I'm going to add here is, again, not really based on like cultural reasons, but more so based around, again, her recent appearance on Winners at War, where I think her overall legacy went up for most people, even though it didn't for me. But either way, here we do have Natalie Anderson. And again, Natalie Anderson at this point came off of Winners at War, being a massive favorite on that season, having this really incredible run on the edge of extinction, and beyond that was also still a very popular player even from beyond that. Again, she was very popular from her San Juan del Sur appearance, and now being looked at as one of the biggest female physical beasts in the history of the show as well. Again, it really did elevate her legacy, especially from a more production point of view, to where I do think there would have been this push to put Natalie Anderson on the list at this point. And again, I think it's fully justified, as much as I was personally underwhelmed with her Winners at War appearance. But with that, we then move on to 2021, where now we're at the point where Survivor 41 is finally airing. And I think when we get to these more recent years here, this is kind of where I'm struggling to figure out who exactly would have been picked, where there's just so many people that could potentially be picked. And to be fair, by the time we get to the end, I think I'll talk through some people that I did consider for these years that didn't make the cut. But again, there's just so many ways that this could potentially go. Yet for 2021, the people I decided to add here are, again, mostly people that were kind of passed over in previous years, starting it off with Penner. And again, the fact that Penner never really seemed to be that much in contention for the Hall of Fame is kind of a shame, but I can kind of get it at the time. However, I think now, looking at the people that are already in the Hall of Fame, I think it's Penner's time around now, especially considering also this is, again, post Winners at War, where there was a lot of talk about Penner, with Yule talking about Penner's wife's condition on the show, to where, again, I think Penner would have been somewhat fresh on people's minds, or while, again, this is technically like a year and a half after that, I still feel like Penner's, again, one of the bigger characters on the board that hadn't been put on the Hall of Fame at this point, to where, again, I think he would have made the cut. Also, I decided to put on JT at this point, to where, again, JT is one of these people that was kind of being passed over for a bit, and obviously when we last saw him on Game Changers, that was not a great look for him. And obviously, Heroes of Villains looked like this big blunder, though I think something's got to give eventually. I'd be shocked if JT never made the Hall of Fame, considering how big of a character he was at a point and how popular his original win was, to where, again, I decided now is the time to add JT to the list. And the final person I'm adding to the list was a bit of a debate here. Again, I feel like I wanted to have someone from Winners at War, someone whose legacy went up from Winners at War. So I had a bit of a tough time deciding who exactly that is. Yeah, I decided to go with the person who's probably the most palatable from both the online and the casual audience. And that person's Michelle Fitzgerald. Now, again, this one is a little bit hazy, as I think there's probably like bigger casual favorites than Michelle. I think there's probably also people that just have like bigger legacies in the grand scheme of things. But Michelle, again, at this point, had just come off of Winners at War, where, again, she made it to the end for a second time. Again, a lot of that story was about how she wanted to redeem herself for her original appearance and change public perception about her. And again, she did, even though, again, I don't think her game in Winners at War is much better than her original appearance. But again, a lot of people did come out of that season with that opinion. To where, again, I think her public opinion of Michelle at this point would have been very high, to where, considering the fact that, again, like, she had also just recently played, and this is before another full season even finished airing, I think this would have been a point where Michelle would have been pretty high on people's minds. So again, I did go with Michelle here. Next, then moving on to 2022, where, again, this is at the time of Survivor 43, and I decided to just, again, offload 3 more Winners at War people here, 3 people I do think would have made the Hall of Fame at some point, to where, while, again, definitely could qualm with them being placed at this specific point, I decided to just drop them off here. First up, we got Sophie Clark, who, well, I could definitely see a lack of interest from a more casual perspective. I still think it's pretty popular amongst the online community, had a very good run on Winners at War, to where I think that really did elevate people's opinions of her, and in general also has a decent amount of friends on the actual committee itself by this point, to where, again, I think Sophie making it on in this position would not be that surprising. Next up, moving on to, again, probably one of the bigger names, not on the board yet, we do got Sarah Lacina, and again, I think this one could be debatable, just because, again, it's not like Sarah Lacina is this massive popular figure within the Survivor community. Again, when we're at this point now where most of the Winners at War cast is on the Hall of Fame, I do feel like Sarah Lacina finally making the cut would make sense at this point. Again, she is someone that, again, has won a season, obviously, proceeds to dominate an all-winner season alongside Tony, and while, again, Tony definitely deserves more of the credit for that, Sarah definitely deserves some of the credit. And again, she's still part of Cops R Us, which was a very iconic alliance, to where, again, considering recency bias as well, I decided to put Sarah Lacina on at this point. Last person I'm going to put on, again, might be at the chagrin of a lot of the online community, but I do think this person would have made the Hall of Fame at some point, and that person is Ben Driebergen. And again, as much as I don't think Ben played a particularly good game on his winning season, I'm sure there are people that are frustrated at the fact that he quit the game in Winners at War. Ben is still a pretty iconic player in Survivor history. I mean, he is someone that is known for his Ben bombs, having idled out his way to the end, also and fighting idol after idol, him also winning the fire making challenge, which again, as much as that was very questionable from a production point of view, I do think that's something that production themselves look fondly. And I think something to also remember here is that production makes up a good chunk of the committee. Or I think by this point, production would be very high on Ben. Again, Jeff Probst literally said Ben is on his Mount Rushmore before the airing of Winners at War, to where I think Jeff himself would be very much propping up Ben. And I could just see most of the production members in general being very pro-Ben by this point, to where mixing that with the fact that I think around this time was when he was on Challenge USA as well, which also, again, helps Sarah as well. And I think there's a lot of factors here to where I do think Ben would have made the cut, even though, again, a lot of the online community would not have been on board. I do think Ben would have squeaked on to the Hall of Fame at some point down the road, and I decided just to add him in now. And now we're moving on to 2023, obviously during the airing of Survivor 45, and now I'm just offloading against some of the more iconic figures that just simply hadn't made the cut yet, where I feel like this person should definitely be on the Hall of Fame at some point, and that person is James Clement, obviously being voted out with 2 idols in his pocket, obviously very legendary figure there, but also, again, still one of the biggest physical beasts in the history of the show, was on the show 3 times over the course of 6 seasons, which is ridiculous, also one fan favorite for 2 seasons in a row, which is also ridiculous, so where, again, James Clement, I think, while his legacy did kind of go down after Heroes vs. Villains, was still a massive icon of the show, to where I'd be remiss if he never made the Hall of Fame. Also, I decided to finally put on Malcolm, to where I actually had a tough time on landing on if Malcolm would even make the Hall of Fame, just because I think the tough thing about Malcolm is that there's not really a great timing for Malcolm to actually make the cut, where again, I think if he were to make the Hall of Fame, obviously the peak of his popularity was around time Cochran got added to the Hall of Fame, and he didn't get added there. Also, in general, I think Denise's legacy kind of lasts a bit more than Malcolm's, where I think we're now in the modern day where Malcolm doesn't get brought up that much, to where, again, I did very much debate if Malcolm should even make the Hall of Fame, as even though I personally like Malcolm and do remember Malcolm, and he was such a fan favorite at the time, I did not know if he'll ever make the cut, though I do think, again, considering how much Malcolm and Denise as a duo is being mentioned a lot in the modern day, I did feel like adding him in at some point did still feel justified. And the final person for this batch that I'm adding on ends up being Aubrey Bracco, who, again, obviously took a hit after Edge of Extinction and her legacy, though I think she's kind of on the recovery at this point, to where Aubrey obviously had a great run on Co Wrong and came back for 2 seasons not too long after that, to where mixing that with the fact that I feel like a lot of the more modern players of Survivor do reference Aubrey quite a bit as being a player that they want to play like, to where, again, I could definitely see a world where we get this big resurgence for Aubrey's popularity, to where I decided now is the time to put her on the Hall of Fame. And with that, we then move on to the most recent year on the list. We got 2024 at the time of Survivor 47, and this is actually pretty difficult here, where, again, as I said, I think there's a lot of contenders that could be added to the Hall of Fame still. And again, we'll run through the people that didn't make it on at the very end. And thinking of who I think would make a fan poll and also who the committee would vote on, I did decide to put on Stephen Fishbach at this point. I think Stephen Fishbach, obviously still a big fixture of the online community, still does know-it-alls, still, again, is talked about enough to have the name recognition for the Hall of Fame. Well, also, it's brought up as, again, the ultimate Survivor duo. Again, we see so many times in recent seasons where they reference JT and Steven, to where, again, considering I already put JT on the list, I feel like now's the time for someone like Steven to make the list. So again, I put him on. And then the other 2 are a bit more recent, and these might be a bit controversial. However, I do feel like, considering the recency bias in the actual Hall of Fame picks, I do feel like these are people that would have been added around this time. The first one would be another kind of Ben Driebergen style pick, where I'm sure the online community would be a bit annoyed. Yeah, I do think this person would have made it by this point, and that person is Rick Devens. And again, Rick Devens, as much as I probably wouldn't personally have him in my Hall of Fame, I do think this is a point where I do think Jeff in particular would have been campaigning for Rick Devens. And also considering how prominent Rick Devens is in the online community and, again, has a lot of friends in the alumni community, I do feel like Rick being added to the list at this point just kind of makes sense. So while he wouldn't necessarily be my personal pick, I do feel like this is a route that I could see it going from a realistic point of view. And the final pick here, we actually have a new era player. And again, this is the debate here. Is it too early? But again, they literally put Cochran on not even a year after his winning season. So the person I'm going to put on here is the only new era person on the Hall of Fame here, which was actually a debate between two. However, I end up going with Marianne. Now, I think there's a serious world where it's Carolyn, as I do think Carolyn's probably the biggest name of the new era at this point. I think she is someone that is constantly mentioned as someone that players want to be the most like, and like a story that people were inspired by. Yeah, I think at this point, I would personally go Marianne. While I do think, again, the following year, maybe Carolyn would be added. I think at this point, again, Marianne is a winner. I think that definitely helps her legacy there. Also, again, is still talked about constantly. Also is a very prominent fixture in the online community. I feel like has near universal approval ratings, where I don't know how many people really hate Marianne. Or I know there's a lot of people that do very much dislike Carolyn, where, again, I feel like those are definitely aspects that are adding to Marianne's placement here over Carolyn. Again, I do think it would have been close between her and Carolyn. Yeah, I decided to go with Marianne, as I just feel like Marianne's a bit more palatable to pretty much everybody. So I feel like there's enough detractors of Carolyn to make Marianne the pick instead. But again, that is caught up to the modern day, and those are people that I think would have made the Hall of Fame by this point in Survivor history. However, I do want to talk about some people that never made my Hall of Fame list, though. Again, people that I think should be in the Hall of Fame, or people that I would expect to be in the Hall of Fame relatively soon afterwards. So again, going in chronological order of when they first played, I do want to mention Amber, not because I think Amber is like a major lock to be in the Hall of Fame by any means, but I do think, again, this is a spot at this point where obviously Rob is on the Hall of Fame. Also, again, a lot of people that played Winners at War with Amber are on the Hall of Fame. To where, again, she would have a lot of friends at this point wanting to vote her in. Again, we already had Rob trying to vote in Amber into the Hall of Fame earlier in the show's history. To where, again, I think there's definitely a chance Amber makes the Hall of Fame by this point. To where again, she was a contender there. Also, Lex is a big contender, to where I very much considered Lex pretty much almost every single year. I think Lex is someone that, if you swap out Lex for another player along the way, I would not be that upset at that. I think there's a serious chance of that, especially considering, again, Lex has a massive support from the alumni community. Again, we were in a situation where if you look at the actual ballots, so again, I think Lex definitely has the backing of the alumni community. However, I just don't know how much of the remaining votes he's really going to get, and that's kind of the reason why he never actually made my cut, to where I don't feel like anyone really talks about Lex that much in the modern day. But again, definitely someone that could have made the cut by now. Same thing goes with Kathy. I think probably less so, to where I don't think Kathy was really being brought up as much as Lex, as being someone that should have been in the Hall of Fame. And even beyond that, again, I don't feel like as many people just talk about Kathy in the modern day, to where, while I think Kathy definitely is worthy of being in the Hall of Fame, I don't think she would have made it on, but again, she's someone I did consider. Also, I consider Chris Doherty, obviously the winner of Vanuatu, and a player that, again, does get mentioned here and there of being an impressive winner. Obviously, his final trial performance gets mentioned, him being the guy that beat all the women gets mentioned, him probably having some of the best confessionals in the history of the show, yet sadly, I do think he probably would have been overshadowed enough to where I don't know if he would even be in consideration still at this point. I do want to mention Eliza, someone that, again, at this point, I do think is looked at as a really great character, someone that has these great reactions from the jury, and obviously you have the effing stick moment, to where, again, I think she would be in consideration, though I don't think she quite makes it on just yet. Also want to mention Amy, who is someone that was this big villain on Vanuatu, who also brought representation for the LGBT community as well, to where, again, I think she's someone to mention here, though I don't think she would have made it on yet. Also would have considered someone like Danny Boatwright along the way, where I know Jeff very much hyped up Danny Boatwright at points in Survivor history, though I do think she would have struggled to make it in before Winners at War, and I think Winners at War probably sadly tainted her reputation to where she probably did not make it on at that point. Terry Dietz is someone to mention here, obviously someone that won 5 immunity challenges on his season, had this massive underdog run, someone that sadly had to get pulled in Cambodia, to where I think in general Terry Dietz is someone that is pretty beloved in the Survivor community. I don't think anyone really has that negative thing to say about him. Yeah, I do think at the end of the day, again, just kind of tough to squeeze him onto the list at this point. I also considered Yao-Man. Yao-Man, again, was very popular back in the day, but also is a pretty big game changer. Again, he was the first person on the show shown to be using a fake idol, and again, I think Yao-Man definitely worthy of being on the Hall of Fame. Yeah, I just never really found the spot for him. Also, I consider Todd, who, again, another very impressive winner, someone that I think a lot of people really wanted to see back for Winners at War, and someone that I think the online community holds very highly. I don't know how many votes there necessarily were going to be from the committee, though again, I think Todd's definitely another one that could have been on. Eric Reichenbach is someone to mention here, obviously due to his big mistake, but I still think he's someone that, again, gets commonly talked about in the modern day. Now, again, I think the fact that he's known for something bad is probably something that might keep him off of Hall of Fame, but I do think it is something to at least mention here. I will at least mention Philip, obviously considering he was essentially like the coach of his seasons, to where obviously coach is on the Hall of Fame. I will say I do think there's a bit more negativity tinged towards Philip Phillip, to where I think people have kind of grown to love Coach, where I don't know if that's necessarily happened with Phillip. Though again, he was such a big star at the time to where I'd at least want to mention him. I do also want to mention Andrea. Now, I do think Andrea's kind of one of these players that her time is probably past at this point. I mean, there was a period of time where everyone is mentioning Andrea as someone that they want to play the most like, yet I do think we're at a time now where she's kind of been overtaken by Wentworth and other people, to where I don't know if Andrea's necessarily as high on people's boards. Also, I'll mention Sierra Easton, and I'll be honest, I kind of forgot about Sierra Easton until really late into the process of making this video, but again, maybe she would have made the Hall of Fame by now. She probably would have, to be honest, but I will mention her here, where obviously she's the most renowned for the person who voted her mom. It's a lot of credit for like kicking off this like big moves era of the show, and obviously went to a rock draw, where again, I think there's a lot of reason why Sierra would be picked here, though looking back at my list, I don't know where exactly you would squeeze her on anyway. I do think maybe 2023, but again, she's definitely someone that would be in the Hall of Fame at some point down the road. Now, I'll mention Cass here as well, obviously a massive villain for the show, someone that probably would be in the running at this point. I think should be hovering on the edge of being a true contender for the list. Yeah, again, I do think she's someone that would definitely be starting to peak around this point. Also, I'll mention Spencer, who I think would have been a shoo-in to eventually make the Hall of Fame had this been around the time of Cambodia. The obviously time had gone on, and again, doesn't have the most favorable outlook nowadays, but I do think there's a period where, again, he would have been a shoo-in. Also, I'll mention Mike Holloway, again, another person that had a big underdog run, won 5 immunity challenges, won out from the final 9 on. Jeff adored his win at the time. I do think Mike Holloway, again, would be in the talks, be in the Hall of Fame by this point, though I do think considering production doesn't seem to be as high on him anymore, I do think that would kind of harm his chances in the grand scheme of things. I will also mention Joe, not because I think Joe would have any shot anymore, but I think he would have been a shoo-in had this been around the time of Cambodia. Yeah, I think as time goes on, obviously, I think his likelihood of getting in is very unlikely. I think the next person I would take into consideration is Tai Trang, where, again, Tai was just such a big character at the time. Also, the first person to ever get the CEO award, to where, in the fact that he had these, like, 2 really deep appearances and with this massive character, again, I think there's a lot of reason to have Tai on the Hall of Fame, yet he did not make my cut. I do also want to mention Zeke, where obviously this one's more so for the cultural impact of this and the fact that obviously the moment of him getting outed is a major moment for the show, or while obviously very dark and it happened, it does turn into Zeke becoming a representative for trans community while also getting Survivor nominated for GLAAD Awards, where I do think Zeke is a pretty prominent figure here, though I didn't feel like he fit into the Hall of Fame just yet. Also, I mean, we might as well talk about them at once. I did also consider both Dominic and Wendell, both of which obviously being involved in the first ever tie in Survivor history, and were also talked about as this massive duo in the game that gets mentioned here and there. Beyond this, though, I still do think nowadays the likes of JT and Steven kind of overshadow Dom and Wendell as a duo. Yeah, again, Dom and Wendell is still a very iconic duo, to where, again, I think they're one of these that probably would be added at some point down the road. But I think by this current point, it just probably would not happen. Yeah. Also, something I want to take into consideration here, probably something that might not come to most people's minds, but I do want to talk about Chris Underwood. And Chris Underwood, I think, as time goes on, ends up being a pretty big game changer for the show, where I think him throwing himself into fire and the ramifications of that do pay a lot of dividends in certain people's jury prospects, to where, again, I think Chris Underwood is a very important player in Survivor history at this point. I think, again, it's maybe a little bit too early to be adding him to the Hall of Fame, especially considering I don't know how much support he'll really have from either side of the polling. Yeah, I think eventually Chris Underwood would probably end up making the cut. Finally getting a new era. Again, I think all these people are just a bit too recent. I really felt like the first time to really add someone to a new era is, again, around the time of 47. I think before that would feel a bit too soon. And Marion's the earliest person I could see in true contention, though I do think a major consideration for down the road would be Jesse. I think Jesse is someone that would definitely be on ballots around this point in the show. Very much talked about as one of the best players to never win. I feel like it's pretty decently connected in the alumni community, along with the fact that Jeff literally said at the time of 43 that Jesse blindsiding Cody was a Hall of Fame move, to where, again, I think there's a lot of signs towards Jesse eventually making it on. Obviously, again, Carolyn is probably the next one on the board. Again, I think if we're doing Hall of Fame for 2025, I think Carolyn makes the cut. I think she is pretty much on the Hall of Fame pretty soon afterwards. But again, I decided not to put her on for 2024. I also consider Jam Jam, who also is a very popular winner, someone that I think over time would have been looked at very favorably, where I think he's kind of the epitome of like a social player winner at this point, to where, again, I do think eventually he'll be added on. And the last person I'll mention here is D, to where, obviously, again, this is very recent from Dee's win. I think over time, she'll be remembered pretty fondly as this very dominant female winner. And considering her appearance on like the On Fire podcast and everything, I do feel like Dee being on the Hall of Fame and having the support production is not that shocking. But again, I decided now was not the right time for it. But there we go. I mean, at this point, we've essentially run through pretty much every main topic I wanted to talk about within scope of the Survivor Hall of Fame. Again, we've talked about the general background around it. We talked about who is actually on the actual Survivor Hall of Fame. We're also talking about predictions. What would have happened to Survivor Hall of Fame if it continued, along with talking about some honorable mentions of people that I would have wanted to make the cut. To where, again, I think I've talked about most of what I can talk about the Survivor Hall of Fame. And again, in general, I do really enjoy making these style of videos about these very niche topics in Survivor history. For straight up, I'm not entirely sure what the next one will be. Yeah, I'm sure I have some more weird ideas like this for down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.